Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Cafe Oleh. My name is Jay, and together at Cafe Oleh with Nefesh B'Nefesh, we go over the everyday Hebrew you need here in Israel to succeed, whether that is reading and paying your utility bills, not just electricity, of course, going grocery shopping and reading nutritional labels, keeping up with the news, striking up a conversation, dates, interviews, whatever it may be, but your everyday interactions in your native language, in your countries of origin, but here in Israel in Hebrew. As always, we want to hear from you what topics you'd like us to cover. If you have any ideas or suggestions or requests for us to cover, please write to us. You can either do so if you're joining us live on the chat on Zoom, rather, in the chat window, or emailing us at Nefesh B'Nefesh. You can also see all our previous lessons on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com, type in Cafe Oleh. You'll see a whole playlist of all of our previous lessons. This lesson will be up on YouTube in the next few days. Those of you who are subscribed and get the updates on Cafe Oleh by email will get an email with this, along with today's vocabulary. So with that, let's get started. This is a topic that comes up quite a lot. It actually was brought up last week when we were talking about certain words, certainly in terms of nonverbal communication and sarcasm and all the other ways that language is used that a dictionary can't necessarily document. We got into a long conversation about the word mamash, right? Mamash means very and really, but only used in certain contexts. We're going to go over that word today, again, in the context of how to improve your adjectives. Hebrew is a very descriptive language. You're used to using adjectives all the time in English, although oftentimes we talk in very and really all the time, and that can be in our native language too. I'm really excited to show this really interesting topic to you that I really think you're going to really enjoy. How many of us have cringed when other people have said that? But invariably, when we can't find our words, we often do the same. So this lesson is not about just learning adjectives, right? We'd be here for a really long time if we were going through that. Instead, we're going to go through how to spot the patterns that many adjectives in Hebrew take, and specifically ones that are going to elevate your Hebrew. Many of the people on this call are at a more introductory level. These are ways to spot the patterns that are inherent in the Hebrew language, and we've talked about that a lot recently. We're going to talk about it again tonight. The patterns that certain words take, so that you know, number one, it's an adjective, but also it's giving you a little bit more description, a little bit more nuance than just saying something is very blank and the equivalent in Hebrew. So as always, you are welcome to screenshot today's lesson. Like I said, you'll be getting a spreadsheet, a link to the spreadsheet in the next day or so. It will also be up in the YouTube description when it goes up. So any questions about what we're talking about tonight, please write it in the Q&A window only. If you have questions, concerns, comments, requests for topics, please write that in the chat window only if you're joining us live on Zoom. So first, a review of what we talked about last week, because it does have to do with adjectives, are the words me'od and mamash. Right at the top of the screen, you see here Hebrew in the middle with the dots and bars that indicate vowel sounds called nikud, transliteration on the right, English, and notes on the left. You'll also see an extra category on the left called categories, because you're going to see how these words are made. They invariably have similar meanings to each other. And again, Hebrew is all about patterns, right? I talk about it being 7th, 8th grade algebra. By being so predictable in that respect, you are able to see what words mean, not just by their shoresh, the letters that make up its root. Shoresh means root, but also the vowel pattern around it. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more in a bit. So first, let's go over again what we talked about last week, the words me'od and mamash. These are called intensifiers, right? Something is not good, it's very good, or it's really good, okay? Me'od is always going to be your go-to, right? Tov me'od, very good. Ta'im me'od, very tasty, very delicious, okay? Mamash, as we talked about last week, is really only meant to be used when you're exaggerating something, okay? And the notes are here, so if you forget that, when you get this spreadsheet of vocabulary in the next few days, it'll be reminded to you, as it says here in the notes on the left. Mamash only is used when you're exaggerating, either earnestly, meaning seriously, or sarcastically. Why is it mamash ta'im? You really enjoy that. Whatever you're eating is really delicious. Okay, if you just want to say ze me'od ta'im or ze ta'im me'od. Me'od for many adjectives can go before or after the adjective. Typically in Hebrew, adjective comes after the noun it modifies. Okay, but me'od can sometimes go in either, same with mamash, but you're going to use me'od when you want to say really or very more than mamash. Okay, as we talked about the other week. Let's keep going here. Okay, this next group of adjectives are more like modifiers. They aren't adjectives per se, but they help out adjectives in that we use them when we're comparing, comparatives, and superlatives. Something is big, bigger, and biggest. How do we say that in Hebrew? We've talked about this before, but it's a good review if we're already talking about adjectives. Okay, so we have three words that we use again and again in Hebrew. Yoter, pachot, and achi. Yoter means more. Okay, simply what it means. Yoter always means more. Pachot, less. And achi means the most. Now, as it says here in the transliteration, and listen to how I'm saying achi, okay, that hey at the beginning is barely vocalized. It's barely aspirated. It's more like achi, right? It almost sounds like the word achi, my brother, in Hebrew. It's the subject of what used to be a well-seen bumper sticker in Israel, Kravi ze achi achi. Kravi ze achi achi. Kravi means combat, meaning someone who serves in a combat role in the army. Kravi ze achi achi. Kravi is the most. Combat is the best or the most. Kama achi, brother. Right? It's a play on of all the sounds of those words, but achi means most. Okay, and here's some sample sentences to know how to use these. Okay, so first one, Hi yoter chachama mimeni. She is smarter than me. She, yoter, more, chachama, smart, feminine, because we're talking about he, mimeni, than me. Okay, hi yoter chachama mimeni. It's a comparative, right? She is smarter than me. Right? Now let's use the word pachot. Hu pachot chacham mimech. He is not as smart as you, or in very poor English, he is less smart than you. But that sort of illustrates what we're saying here, right? He is not as smart as you. Pachot chacham mimech, or mimcha, depending on the gender that you want to use, but it's spelled the same way in Hebrew. Okay. And then finally, if you want to be superlative, the most or more, right? Ata achi chacham bamisrad. Row 11 here. Ata achi chacham bamisrad. Ata, you, masculine. Achi, the most. Chacham, smart, aka the most smart, the smartest. Bamisrad, in the office. Okay. The other way you can say this in Hebrew is instead of Ata achi chacham bamisrad, Ata hechacham beyoter bamisrad. You are the smartest in the office. It means the exact same thing. It's just a different way that we create it, right? Chacham yoter, hechacham beyoter. Chacham, yoter chacham. Chacham means smart, right? Yoter chacham, smarter, like we had in our first simple sentence. Smarter, yoter chacham or yoter chachama. And the smartest is either achi chacham. It's a little bit of a tongue twister there. Achi chacham or chacham beyoter or chachama beyoter. Okay, Notice how it works. It's really simple in Hebrew. There's none of that smart, smarter, smartest versus most, more like we have in English. Same words, same construction every single time, regardless of the adjective being used, number one. And number two, all these words, me'od, mamash, yoter, pachot, and achi, none of these conjugate, regardless of who you're talking about and how many are smarter or bigger or smaller, whatever it is, these do not conjugate. They stay exactly the same regardless of gender and numbers. Okay? Intensifiers, comparatives, and superlatives. We've talked about these before, but I wanted to get these, address them, and now get them out of the way so we can talk about other categories of adjectives that you use all the time. You probably didn't know the fancy English word with them, but also, again, pay attention to the patterns that you hear and see in the spelling of these words. Okay. Our next category of adjectives, rows 13 to 20, are what I'm going to call the ables or ibles. The ables and ibles are words that we have in English. Think readable, legible, edible, drinkable, potable, accessible, all those words, right? We're taking an action and we're adding able or ible. You are able to do those things, or those things are able to be done. Okay, we have the exact same thing in Hebrew, and listen to how these words sound, and even look at the spelling. Even if you can't read Hebrew well yet, you can hear and see a very specific pattern in these words. So I'm going to go through these, and then we're going to talk about them briefly afterwards, right? So the word for edible is achil. Okay, achil has the same root as the word, as the verb to eat, le'echol, right? We've talked about how important shorashim are. The shorash of this word, the three letters that make up this word, aleph, chet, chaf, aleph, chaf, and lamed, have something to do with food, to eat. Le'echol is to eat. Ochel is food. Okay, in this case, achil, edible. We take that word, add the verb, eating, and we just add the ibl at the end to understand edible. Okay, if something is achil, it's edible. Next word, yatziv. Yatziv, stable. Lehatziv is to stabilize something or to place it. So yatziv, stable. These are all adjectives, and the default in Hebrew is the masculine singular. Okay, all of these can be conjugated, and we'll go through those really quickly in a minute. I have to go through all of them. Nagish. Lageshet is to approach. Nagish is accessible. Nadir. Nadir, rare. Kari. Nadir, by the way, rare in the sense of something is not common, not in the sense of food that is not cooked. Kari. Kari comes from the same root as likro, to read or to call. So kari is legible or readable. I like the word legible. You pick the one that you want, but it means the same thing. Ra'il. Ra'il is poisonous. It comes from the same root as the word ra'al, poison. Shavir. Shavir, fragile, literally breakable. Okay? If you want to use that able at the end, breakable. Lishbol is to break. Shavir, breakable, aka fragile. Either word. And then finally, shachiach. Shachiach means common, or literally forgettable, right? It comes from the same root, shin kaf chet, as lishkoach, to forget. So shachiach, forgettable, aka common, or widespread, or easily found, however you want to do it. Not common in the UK sense of common, common in the sense of widespread. Okay, as you hear with all of these words, they have a very specific vowel pattern. A-E, 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 again and again, and they all conjugate the exact same way. Achil, achila, achilim, achilot. Yatziv, yatziva, yatzivim, yatzivot. Nagish, nagisha, nagishim, nagishot. All of these, again, how profoundly simple and uniform Hebrew is. All of these words mean, adjectives mean something able, ible, and they all conjugate the exact same way. To show you how common this is, I just want to stop here and reshare my screen for a second. I want to show you our wonderful online resource, pe'alim.com. As I've talked about before, the virtues of this page, but one of the things it does, both for verbs and for nouns and adjectives, is it tells you the pattern, right? We've talked about this with regards to verbs before, the binyanim. We've talked about this with verbs and adjectives. With verbs and adjectives, we call it a mishkal, from the same root as shekel, our currency in Israel, but also lishkol, to weigh something. And we use the letters kuf, tet, lamed to indicate the vowel patterns for these. As you see, there are 86 words, at least, actually a couple are missing from this list, that have the pattern ai, or as we would call it, katil. Okay? And if you look at pe'alim.com, it gives you a whole list of these. It's a really cool resource. If you wanted to find this, by the way, on your own, you go to pe'alim.com, type in any of the words in Hebrew that we're talking about in this category, and you'll see it'll say next to it katil pattern, meaning one of these. So if we look at, for example, another one that has a bullet at the end, amin. Amin, aleph, mem, nun, comes from the same root as the word leha-amin, to believe, emunah, faith. It means reliable, as you see here. Amin, aleph, mem, nun, part of speech, adjective, katil pattern, right? Authentic, true, reliable, trustworthy. See how uniform it all is. It gives you the word on the left, the root, the shoresh, what part of speech is, and we're talking about adjectives tonight. And katil is that vowel pattern, a-e. That's what it refers to. The katala is just the filler consonants to make sure that you understand this pattern. And then it gives you the meaning on the right. Okay, 86 of these. There's more of them. So you see, it just keeps going. It's a great list. This is a great resource. You see here at the top, by the way, you can see all the different mishkalim. We've talked about this before, but really quickly, in Hebrew, as opposed to verbs, right? There are 7 binyanim. There are 7 verb patterns in Hebrew that indicate not just how you conjugate a verb, but also its meaning. In Hebrew, there are many, 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 dozens and dozens of mishkalim. No one, even in native Hebrew speakers, learn the mishkalim the way that you learn binyanim, or the way that I'm teaching it to you today. They just don't. There is no resource for that for whatever reason, partially because there are so many of them. But now you understand one of these mishkalim, one of these forms that we create words from, particularly adjectives, in this case, the able, ibl adjectives. Again, see that pattern, recognize it. So when you hear a word that follows this, maybe it is one of these, and certainly in its context, you'll be able to tell, is it an adjective and its meaning. And if it's an adjective, maybe it's one of these able, ibls. Just as you see, there are at least 86 of them. We just have a few here. Let's get to another really important category in Hebrew. This one we use all the time. And we've talked about this word before. It's an important grammatical concept to understand, even if you don't understand it in English, is the participle. Participles are taken from verbs, and from the verbs, they can turn into adjectives and adverbs, right? It's usually ing at the end of the word, the equivalent in English, by the way. And participles can be present or past. I'm going to give you, you're going to see some examples in a bit, but the way we form these is really simple. It's really, really simple. All you do is use zman hoveh. Zman hoveh, present tense, right? You add the definite article ha at the beginning of it. You conjugate the verb for present tense, and that's it. You have a participle. So you can say a lot more in using a participle with a lot fewer words than you can in English. Here's a great example. Our first one. Okay. Hagever haomed mul hadelet me'ashen sigaria. Simple sentence. In English, right? In English, we would have to say the following. The man who is standing against or by the door, mul can be either against or by, but the man who is standing by the door is smoking a cigarette. Listen to what I just said. The man who is standing. 5 words in English. Hagever ha'omed. 2 words in Hebrew. In 2 words, we just described a man much more efficiently in general, and certainly in comparison to English, where we had to use 5 words to say it. There are some participles that use far fewer words in English. The singing man, right? I'm not saying the man is singing. I'm saying the singing man walks down the street, right? In that case, we're going to use the same amount of words in English as we do in Hebrew, and great. But the standing man by the door smokes a cigarette doesn't really translate so well in English. In Hebrew, it's beautiful Hebrew. We have just given this guy so much more description without having to go on a slight grammatical tangent to say that he's number one standing. The man is standing by the door, and the man standing by the door is smoking a cigarette. We put that all into one by simply saying hagever ha'omed. Okay, that's it. The standing man, literally the standing man, but in better English, the man who is standing. Okay, really simple. That's how we use the participle in Hebrew. Yes, there are other ways to write this sentence. If anyone wants to correct me, that's wonderful. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about participles. Participles make it much easier for you to use Hebrew. You don't have to use all these modifiers like that and which and things like that. You can simply just say gever ha'omed, and it's clear. It's not just any man, it's the man who is standing. Okay? Now, we're going to say the same thing in a different way, just again to illustrate how descriptive participles can be. הגבר המעשן סיגריה עומד מול הדלת. The man who is smoking is standing by the door. The man who is smoking a cigarette, is standing by the door. Right? I could say the smoking man, but to say that in English is very unclear. Right? If I say the smoking man, is he smoking something, or is he smoking as in his clothes are on fire, or his self is on fire? Whereas in Hebrew, there's no ambiguity here. I'm being very descriptive and very specific. Hagever hameashen sigaria, it's very clear. It's a man who is smoking, even without the word sigaria, right? The cognate for a cigarette in Hebrew. I know that it's the guy who's smoking. Not the guy who's on fire, not the guy who has smoke coming off him, the guy who is physically smoking. That's the power of participles in using them as adjectives. Okay, all it is the present tense of a verb with the definite article ha. Okay? And it does conjugate according to what we're talking about. So if you're talking about hageveret hameashenet sigaria, the woman who is smoking a cigarette, right? Hagveret hameashenet, right? Meashen has to conjugate according to what it's modifying, just like any other adjective would. Okay, now let's talk about past participles. Past participles don't mean that the action we're talking about all takes place in the past. Simply what we're modifying has already taken place, right? So we said here, hagever ha'omed, the man who is standing is smoking a cigarette, right? He currently is standing and he's currently smoking a cigarette. What happens if the guy was standing is smoking a cigarette, or the guy who was smoking is standing, or something along those lines where the modifier, the participle, already took place? Let's look at that. Hareshima, here we're in row 26. Hareshima hameudkenet mofia ala masach hamuf'al. Okay, I gave you 2 past participles in 1 sentence. Just like the other one, we're going to flip it in a second. Hareshima hameudkenet, the updated list. Reshima is a list. Meudkenet is the feminine version of meudkan, which means updated. To update is le'adken. Me'adken means updates. He updates, but also updating, right? But if I want to say updated, because that's usually how we use that word in English, we would use the same in Hebrew. Excuse me. Hareshima hameudkenet, the updated list, right? So the verb le'adken, to update, is now conjugated in the passive. Okay, So when we say past participle in the fancy sense in the English term, what we're really saying is the passive form of the verb, right? Think of it just how it says in English, the updated list, right? ED in Hebrew, in English, excuse me, can either mean the past or the passive. Hebrew, we love our passive. This is how you do it. Hareshima hameudkenet. Hareshima hameudkenet, the updated list, mofia, appears, al, on, hamasach hamufal. Very important. Hamasach hamufal, the enabled screen. Masach is a screen, or a either like a drop-down screen or like a computer screen, and mufal is another past participle. Muf'al comes from the verb lahaf'il, to operate or to enable. Okay, and this is simply the past participle, enabled. Okay, so hareshima hameudkenet, the updated list, appears mofi'a al hamasach hamuf'al, appears on the enabled screen. Okay, we take the word that we want to turn into an adjective, we conjugate it in the present tense, and then we decide, has that already happened, so the past, or is it still taking place, present, right? The list is not constantly updating. That's not what we're saying here. It has been updated. Hareshima hameudkenet, it has been updated. The updated list, not any list, that one, the one that has already been updated, appears on hamasach hamuf'al, right? You're in a room and there's multiple screens in front of you. It could be an office, it could be a conference room. And what does it say? That there's one screen that is showing it, and it's the one that's enabled to show the updated list. Think how you would say it in English. We have the exact same way to say it in Hebrew. And just the reverse of that sentence, but saying exactly the same thing. Al hamasach hamuf'al, on the enabled screen, mofia et hareshima hameudkenet. Okay, on the enabled screen appears the updated list. Now look at the difference between these two, right? The first sentence, very simple. Subject, verb, object. Subject, hareshima hameudkenet, mofia, verb, object, al hamasach hamuf'al. Very simple. This next one, we change it a little bit, right? Al hamasach hamuf'al mofia et hareshima hameudkenet. The hareshima hameudkenet becomes the direct object because the subject is the masach muf'al. Okay, it's just a different way of saying the exact same thing. The point though here is not about the word order. The point though are these participles. In the first example of the present ones, omed and me'ashen, and in the second ones, me'utkenet and muf'al. Okay, present tense, either in the active or passive forms, turn into a participle when we use it the exact same way. Ha plus zman hovev. Ha plus present tense. Okay, let's get to another category. Causative. Again, these could be thought of as participles because these come directly from hif'il, right? It's the fifth binyan, it's the fifth verb formation in Hebrew, which we know we call hif'il, and it's known to be causative. Many of the verbs that appear in this form of conjugation have something to do to cause an action to someone or something else. And what you'll see here are, these can be considered participles again. And they can also be standalone adjectives, right? And these specifically, especially the ones that you're about to see or you are already looking at the screen, are really good fillers when you're tired of saying tov me'od. Okay, first off, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of words in Hebrew to say the equivalent of tov and tov me'od. So you don't have to say tov and tov me'od on a regular basis. I'm very guilty of that. All my life, I've always said the word fine. It's a terrible habit, right? This is going to help you get out of that in Hebrew because you have just as descriptive words in English, so too do you have in Hebrew. And let's look at how they're created So you can also discern future ones for you to use. These are just sample ones from the causative form of verbs. First one is Mavlik, right? Mavlik could be used as a regular verb. Mavlik comes from the infinitive lehavrik, which is to shine or to cause something to shine, as in I shine, I polish the silver, or I shine the shoes. Okay, Mavlik. Mavlik has the same root, bet resh kuf, as the word barak, lightning, which we are about to have here in Israel, throughout Israel in the next few days. We're going to have quite the storm system coming through. But Mavlik, to cause something to shine, aka brilliant. So if I want to say, oh, that's brilliant, not just in it's shiny brilliant, but brilliant as in, again, the British way, amazing, wonderful, great, Mavlik. Okay, Mavlik, this also gets conjugated just like our other ones. So Mavlik, Mavrika, Mavriki, Mavrigot, Mavrikot. Okay, from the causative verbal form, we get an adjective, Mavlik. Another great one, Magniv. Magniv, if you look up this word or you get a list of other ways to say tov, you're going to get Mavlik, Magniv, and all the other ones on this list. Magniv is not just good or great or excellent. Magniv means captivating. A great word, right? If something is magniv, it is captivating. What a wonderful word in English, same too in Hebrew. It comes from the same root, gimel nun bet, as the verb lignov. Lignov is to steal, right? To cause to steal, to capture, right? To capture is lehagniv, which is the infinitive form of this word here, magniv. Magniv, captivating. Great word. Same with our next one, Maxim. Maxim is not the word maxim. It's not maximum. That's not where this word comes from. This is straight Hebrew. Where does it come from? The root kuf samech mem. Kuf samech mem, kesem means magic. Kosem is a magician. It's also the name of one of Tel Aviv's best falafel places, HaKosem. Kosem is a magician. Maxim comes from the verb lehaksim, to cause magic to happen, to enchant. Maxim, enchanting. Right? So if you call something Maxim, it's not just that it's really good, it's enchanting. What a wonderful word, again, to use. And the last one, marshim. Marshim comes from the verb leharshim, to impress. Marshim, impressive. Okay, so already 3 different sources we've had. Able as a pattern, participles, and now the causative form of the verb gives us even better adjectives. And again, look at this pattern. Mavrik, Magniv, Maxim, Marshim. These are all the present form of if-il verbs. Okay, same thing like with participles, and here we're talking about these very descriptive terms that we can use instead of saying good or fine or excellent. Great set of verbs, adjectives. And finally, in this list, and this is a very short list of these, are the un and im adjectives, right? We had able, now we have un-im. Un-im are all those words we have in English, right? Impossible, unable, illogical, all those words that have changed its meaning by a prefix. We do the exact same thing in Hebrew. We take the prefix bilti. Okay, bilti comes from bli, it comes from bal, both of which mean without or none. We change it to bilti, we add a hyphen, and then we take the adjective to modify it, right? In this case, and look at the pattern here, how these words work. Bilti efshari, our first one. Bilti efshari. Efshari, you know the word efshar, right? We've talked about this word all the time. Efshar means it's possible. It's also the question word may I or shall I, right? Efshar is it is possible. Efshar is it's impossible. But now it's impossible as an adjective, right? We're not saying It is impossible to do to go out tonight, right? We're not saying it is impossible. We're saying going out tonight is impossible. Different change of the words makes impossible now an adjective. Bilti efshari. Efshari means possible as an adjective. Bilti efshari, impossible. Okay, let's look at another one. Bilti hafich. Hafich is one of those ai verbs that we had before, the able ibel. Right? Hafich comes from the root he pe chaf sufit, which means to turn or to turn over. Lahafoch is to turn over. Right? Cafe hafuch is turned over coffee or upside down coffee because of the way you add the coffee and the milk together. We're soon enough going to be celebrating the holiday of Purim, where there's that famous part of the story where we say "V'na fochu," we turn the fate of the Jews on its head. Instead, it's the Jews' pursuants are the ones pursued. Hafich means reversible, right? Flippable is another word to think of it. Bilti hafich, irreversible. Yatziv, we had that already before in the able list. Yatziv, stable. Bilti yatziv, unstable. Okay. Bilti nimna, a really good word to have, especially when you're reading the news in general in Hebrew. Bilti nimna, unavoidable. If something is unavoidable, it is bilti nimna. Nimna, to avoid or prevent. Bilti nisbal. This is one of my absolute favorite words ever. It is whenever you are upset, you are frustrated, you want to be a little bit more descriptive, floored with your words, you call someone or something bilti nisbal. It even comes out with all those implosive sounds. Bilti nisbal. It sounds really, you're angry when you say it, and you should be, because if something is bilti nisbal, it is insufferable. Another great word. And finally, bilti shavir. Bilti shavir, we had shavir before, right? Breakable, fragile. Unbreakable is bilti shavir. Okay, see all these words? Again, notice the pattern. Bilti and followed by the adjective. Bilti will never conjugate. Instead, the adjective being modified will. So bilti efsharit, bilti haficha, bilti yetziva, bilti nimnat, and so forth. Okay, but bilti itself will not conjugate. The other verbs will. Okay. Okay, these are our categories. Again, not an exhaustive list of adjectives. If you want that, there are plenty of online dictionaries that will help you with that. These are to help you recognize patterns in adjectives that are already really good adjectives, but also patterns so you can recognize them moving forward in your own Hebrew learning, that you can expand and improve the quality of describing things, whether it's the able, ibel adjectives, the participles, which we use all the time in Hebrew, especially in the news, causative, if you want to say something is good, but really describe why it's good or how it's good, and the unim verb adjectives. Okay, I'm going to stop here as I see we have a bunch of questions. Okay. So first off, specifically about this lesson, and if we have any time, I'll go through questions that have to do with Hebrew, but not this lesson. Okay. Agnes, what are ways to say your soup is the best? So best is very simple. Agnes, and great question. Best, because best doesn't go really well with our pattern, right? It's best comes from good, right? Good, better, best, right? It's not good, gooder, goodest, unfortunately. It's good, better, best, right? So good is tov. I'll make this bigger in just a second. Make this bigger as well, right? Best is, as we said, good, good, better, best. Tov is, we said this before, right? Superlatives. So we said, how do you say better? Not like that, like this. Yotel tov. We simply take the word yotel, put it in front of the adjective we're modifying. Yotel tov, better. Right? If I want to say my soup is better than yours, amarak sheli yoter tov mimech. Okay, my soup is better than yours. Your soup is the best. Hamarak shelach hu hayoter tov, hatov beyoter. Hatov beyoter. Or we use that word hachi. We say achitov. Okay, so as you asked, your soup is the best. Hamarak shelcha or shelach, depending on the who you're speaking to. Hu hatov beyoter, because marak is masculine. Hu hatov beyoter, and we use the word hu here to indicate we're again referring to the soup, emphasizing that. Hu hatov beyoter or hu achitov. Marak achitov, hu marak shelach or shelcha hu achitov, or hamarak shelcha or shelach hu hatov beyoter. That's how you say your soup is the best. Okay. Other questions in the Q&A box. Susan, explain the difference between binyan and mishkal. Really simple, Susan. We've talked about this in the past when we've done other grammatical lessons, but really quickly. They mean the same thing. Okay, when we're referring to the form that a verb, that a shoresh takes. And when I say the form, that is, for example, these words, right? It's not enough that we're using the shoresh aleph chaf lamed. Aleph chaf lamed we know has something to do with food. So whatever word this root appears in, it has something to do with food. We need to conjugate it to use it appropriately. Are we using it as a verb? Are we using it as a noun? Are we using it as an adjective? And so forth. This specific form is a mishkal because we're modifying it to become an adjective, edible, right? We take the root meaning food in some respect or eating, and we turn it into an adjective, specifically this able type of adjective, achil. Okay, mishkal refers to the forms that we use to create nouns and adjectives. Binyan is what we use to create verbs. That's the only difference. Binyan is only for verbs. Mishkal is for nouns and adjectives. And both of those are simply down to what extra letters and vowel patterns we use to conjugate these shorashim into everyday words that we can use instead of just abstract thoughts. Okay, great question. Ken, do adjectives become nouns in Hebrew as they sometimes do in English? I.e., the edibles are on the table. Do adjectives become nouns? They can. Absolutely. You could say that as the, let's see. Yes, when it's understood what the subject is, Ken, you can turn an adjective into a noun without saying the noun itself. You said the edibles, it's not the same though. You couldn't say ha'achilim. That's not understood. You can't just say that as a sentence and be understood. You could say no, it doesn't conjugate the same way as it does in English. You would have to be very specific here and include the noun that you're trying to say. Julie, so is the hey at the beginning of these words like who? Yes, you can think about it like that, Julie. You can think about it in that respect for these, but also think about it again, the singing man. Okay, hagever hashal. Hagever hashal is in English, we could say the man who is singing, or we can simply say the singing man. Okay, it's really the singing man because we don't have a further word to indicate the man who is singing. If you want to translate in your head as ha, that's fine. Just remember, it doesn't always translate the same way. Hagever hashar, the singing man. Okay. More questions. Esther, like I said, mul can mean against or next to. Depends on the context. Alan, why mofia et? I knew someone was going to ask that, which is why I talked about subject, verb, object before. Thank you, Alan. Al hamosach hamufal mofia et hareshima hameudkenet. Remember, folks, we're talking about adjectives. When we talk about adjectives, we're modifying nouns, meaning we're being very specific about what we're referring to. Et always precedes a direct object. If you don't know what a direct object is, folks, I want to have strong words with your elementary teachers. Direct object is I pick up the phone, not just any phone, the phone. Okay, by picking up the phone, I am directly referring to this object. That is a direct object. I pick up the phone. There is no other action happening, and it's not an indirect object. I went to the store. To the store is an indirect object. Okay, but when it's a direct object in Hebrew, it is always preceded by et. Et itself does not mean anything. It is always used before a direct object. In this case, reshima meudkenet is a direct object because I'm talking about al hamasach hamufal, on the enabled screen, on the operating screen in front of me, appears the enabled list. In Hebrew, we can change the order of the words. In classical Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, the verb often comes at the beginning of the sentence. Right? Anyone who's ever practiced or read Torah, you know all of those biblical lines, all the sentences in the Tanakh, and especially in Torah, that begin Vayidaber, Vayomer, right? Those are all verbs beginning the sentence. In this case, Mofia et Reshima Meudkenet, on the screen appears the updated list in the literal sense. But because of this format, I have to use the direct object. It's not just any it's not just any list, it's the updated list. And so therefore it's a direct object because I'm specifying which object it is. Alan, when when bilti. So Alan, again, like I said, efshar is impossible, as it is impossible to do something. But when that something is impossible, right, that's an adjective. If it is impossible to go out tonight, efshar latzet halayla. It is impossible to go out tonight. efshar latzet halayla. If I want to say it as it's impossible, meaning an adjective, and that's what we're talking about tonight, only adjectives. Yetzia halayla bilti efsharit. Going out tonight, or yetzia halayla, you wouldn't say it this way in Hebrew. You would say letzet halayla bilti efsharit. To go out tonight is impossible, right? The act of going out is what I'm modifying with the adjective bilti efshari. Efshar simply means it is impossible, but at the beginning of a word and not as an adjective. We're only talking about adjectives here. Stanford, hamon, yes, hamon and harbe mean a lot, right? Simply a lot of something. They don't mean very or really, they mean a lot. So you could say that about some, but it's not an adjective modifier. It would be, the only time you use it with an adjective would be like harbe yoter tov, it's much better than. But even that is not often used. So I didn't include it in this list to confuse people, but good question. Zev, how does one say more or less? We just flip the order in Hebrew, pachot o yoter. We say less or more. but it's the same thing. Pachot o yoter means more or less in Hebrew. Pachot o yoter. Let me write that just so everyone has it. Pachot o yoter. More or less. Okay. Just make that bigger for you. There. Pachot o yoter, more or less. And we do use that expression in Hebrew for sure. Diana, I have a question from learning Latin. Okay. Conjugations were for verbs, declensions for nouns and adjectives. Is the teacher using only the term conjugations? The teacher, meaning me, Diana, you're asking me. You can simply say you. We're very casual here in Israel. Am I using the term conjugations? Yes. It's very clear people don't have a whole grasp on grammatical terms in English, let alone in Latin. So I'm only using the word conjugations. First off, we don't have declensions in Hebrew in the same way you do in Latin or German or Russian, because we don't have cases and all those other things. We're only talking about conjugations to make it easy for people to understand. Okay. Zella, Hachiba Bait Baulam is the slogan of Elal. Yes, that is a great use of the word Hachi. Hachi, if anyone has seen a commercial for Elal Baulam. Let me write it out here. Hachi Bait Baulam. Sorry. Hachi Bait Baulam. Okay, this is the slogan of the official slogan of Elal. You can think of it as the most at home or most at home on Elal, right? Achi means most. And in here, just like the bumper sticker I told you before, Kravize achi, the same thing here. It's the most. It's like a commercial from the 1980s. Talking about, it was from the Dairy Council, and it was using a Broadway song. It's the tops, right? Think of this using this word achi. It's the tops. It's the most. It's the most at home, right? The idea being, if you fly Elal, you'll feel most at home, because I'm not going to fill in the blank with all the stereotypes we have of Elal service, which has gotten better over the years. The point, though, is achi b'bayit ha'olam, most at home. Okay, as in feeling the most at home while flying Elal. Okay. Aliza asks, how does one use a Shoresh dictionary to its maximum benefit? Aliza, if you're thinking of like 501 Hebrew verbs, is memorizing a good technique? It can be. Everyone learns languages differently, Aliza. The point, though, with Hebrew is patterns. It's always about patterns. So you recognize the patterns. And if you can recognize the pattern of the Shoresh and what it means, you're halfway there to understanding the words. If you understand the form in which the word is taking, you also understand a good portion of what the word means. Understanding the shoresh, the root, is important. I wouldn't necessarily memorize shorashim for their own sake, rather how you're going to use these verbs. Again, this class is all about making Hebrew practical and everyday. Memorizing shorashim, memorizing roots, to understand Hebrew may not be practical, because you may not be learning shorashim that you're going to use on an everyday basis, right? There are certain verbs and certain nouns that you use all the time that have specific shorashim, and that's the focus of these classes. Talk more about what you're actually going to use rather than the entirety of Hebrew. That's also why, for example, we don't learn the mishkalim. We don't learn all those different forms that nouns and adjectives can take. Jack, do people still say madhim? Absolutely, Jack. Madhim is a great one. Standing, amazing. But it comes from the same verb as tadhema, which is like shock or nidham. Ani nidham, I'm shocked. Right? So shocking is another way to translate madhim. Shocking, rather, because it's the causative form. Ava, can you use pachot o yoter to answer a question like, do you understand? Yes. Do I understand? More or less. At mevina? Ken pachot o yoter? Yeah, more or less. Perfectly good way to answer a question. Okay. Okay, we are at the top of the, let me just make sure. Yeah, we are at the top. So we need to cut it short here. Unfortunately, I see we have a couple other questions, but we're just not going to make it in time. As always, toda rabba, thank you all for joining us with Cafe Oleh. If you've written to us in the Q&A with your questions, concerns, comments, we'll be looking over that. Don't worry. In the meantime, this lesson and its vocabulary list will go up on YouTube and via email in the next few days. Next week, if I am not mistaken, let me just check my calendar, because I believe next week is our next holiday. It is. So next week is Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat is not only an important holiday here in Israel, it also means it will be 1 month for Purim, and for many people who like the build-up, the drama of it, means it's exactly 2 months from Pesach. But we're going to focus just on Tu B'Shvat. We're going to go over fruits and vegetables and the specific verbs that go with them. And equally important, perhaps more important for my fellow Olim, especially from the West, we're going to talk about seasons of fruits and vegetables in Israel, aka why you cannot get certain fruits and vegetables all year round in Israel. We're going to talk about seasons. We're going to talk about verbs of harvesting. We're talking about certain fruits and vegetables, and any questions you have about that in celebration of Tu B'Shvat, and also what we do in Israel for Tu B'Shvat. Also, it's and how important it has become in Israeli society in the course of modern state of Israel being in existence. So until next week, toda rabba, lihitraot. I will see you all very soon. Take care.